Alright, hello guys, today is the 26th of March 2023. It's been a while since I've recorded any videos. Don't know, I'm in a weird state of mind recently. And as you can see, I'm going for a little bit of an old bearded wise man look. Now we'll see how it works. But nevertheless, today we're gonna talk about first video I'm doing today is about Ukraine, and specifically we're going to look at the situation in Ukraine as it stands now. But what I wanted to talk about more than anything is quite often you come across people talking about how much money do we give to Ukraine. You know, it's like, you see, it's like we just given Ukraine 40 million worth of like stuff, you know. But is it actually true? And the answer is nope, it's not, right? And we're gonna look at why is it like not as true as some people would like it to be. And like I said, I would much rather there were other better people at YouTubing who do these videos, because I kinda not very good. But if you do feel that what I'm about to tell you is something that should be heard by other people, or at least should be more presented to the international community, English speaking, other languages, please do like, please share. Like, I'm gonna be a good YouTuber right now saying that, please do that, because in the end of the day I'm putting those ideas out there and I'm just hoping that people are gonna pick them up, and somebody who's way better than me at talking about this, who's way better than me at diving into those things, can actually do proper videos. But unless those things start getting shared, it's like, you know, really hard, and it kind of sometimes feels a bit like you say stuff and somebody does pick up on that, but some appreciation obviously goes a long way. So we're gonna take a look at what's happening in Ukraine. There haven't been many changes. Like, everybody was talking about this big fight in somewhere here near Bakhmut. Was it around here? Avdiivka, yep. And so there's like a bit of fighting around here. Okay, yeah, near the city of Bakhmut. And again, like, Russians have like put down like, I don't know, 40,000 people just to take a little town over the past like 8 months or something like this. Not obviously a good exchange. People say, oh yeah, but they nearly got the city. It's like, it's a bit of a weird ones, because even if Ukrainians do leave Bakhmut, it's not really matters in a strategic point of view. And I think Ukrainian troops, despite how hard it is, I think for a while they were actually kind of like staying there, because they have probably some position somewhere not far from Bakhmut, so probably somewhere around here. I don't know which tools do I have on this maps. Right, Lineyka, so probably like here's the Bakhmut, and then there's probably some position somewhere here, and I don't know, I'm not sure about the tools on this map, but there's some positions around here somewhere which basically allow Ukrainians artillery to essentially reach the Russian soldiers in every position here, and essentially bringing them down, like, you know, with very little expenses. So like, not having to spend as much force, but they can reach the Russian troops and basically kill as many of them as possible. And obviously, you know, despite what people say, the main target of the defense war is to kill as many attackers as you possibly can, so that they fuck off home, right? I mean, I was born and grew up in a place where my uncles, some of my uncles, like second uncles, third uncles, I don't know, like some parts of my family are still somewhere in Russia. I'm not keeping in touch with them, yes, but there are some. So it's like, you know, as a normal human being, I don't want the people who died there to die. Right, but from the point of view of like, you know, like, yeah, I was born in Ukraine, I was born in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, I grew up in Ukraine overall, I never lived in Russia, for example. But I see that what I would like the Russians to do is pack their shit and fuck off home, right? It's plain and fucking simple. Right? So the target of Ukrainian military is not just to keep some city or, you know, capture some city back. It is to really kill as many Russians as they possibly can with the tools and means that they have at the moment. This is why I was saying, I was like, some time ago I was making a video and saying, hey guys, you know, the faster Europe wakes up and gives proper assistance to Ukrainians, the better it is for Europe in social terms, in economic terms, but also the better it is for Russians, because Ukrainians will be able to kind of kick out their troops, and essentially the faster the Russians leave Ukraine, the less troops they lose, the less people they lose. I know for many people it's kind of a bit weird way of looking at it, but essentially if Ukrainians move forward as fast as they did near Kharkiv or near Kherson, where the Russians, like, let's look at those, get out a bit. So, right. So as we remember, like, those territories were captured really, really, really fast, and most of the Russians that were running away from this area, they just ran away. There wasn't as many soldiers, Russian or Ukrainian soldiers, killed in there, because Ukrainians have managed to make strikes at key points and then just go through, and the Russians were like, okay, time to go, right, and they buggered off. I know it's for many people, but this is probably better for Ukraine and for Russia, to be honest. Same as in Kherson, right? As soon as Ukrainians kind of managed to hit a couple of key points and the Russians understood that they don't have the support necessary to stay on that area, they ran away really, really fast, and there was almost there's more people dying from on both sides, and more civilians suffer while the Russians are somewhere near there, and whilst the Russians are within the vicinity of places. So if we look at Kherson, for example, right, the Russians ran away, but now they're shelling the city for no good reason, right? They're not shelling really any military installations, they just blow up bus stops and things like this, right? Let's just look it up. We're gonna go into Ukrainian. Right. See plenty of like videos and things like this where the Russian troops essentially shut up the city, articles, obviously some of these buildings I recognize. Oh, McDonald's. Well, there was no McDonald's when I lived in Kherson, but what we're seeing is like, so these areas, many of those areas I'd recognize because I was growing up there. Some of the buildings, some of the streets, you know, they were not perfect, but none of them deserve the shelling they get. And like I said, the longer Russians stay in Ukraine, the worse it is, not just for Russians, not just for Ukrainians, but also for Russians, because obviously, you know, they're losing their guys as well as. And to be honest, turning your men into military criminals, people who don't care about bombing a civilian, it's like the worst thing you can fucking do. And I've feel sorry for civilians as well. So the Europe being so slow, but quite often, like I say, I'm showing this because quite often we hear that, oh my God, we're giving Ukraine these billions of euros or millions of dollars worth of support, and why are we wasting all this money, right? And, I mean, let's look at that, right? What was it? Poland provides supplies. Oh, jets to Ukraine. Yay, we've got this one. Poland supplies jets to Ukraine, right? And here's an article of Slovakia joins Poland and sending fighter jets to Ukraine, which is MiG-29 fighter jets. So people go like, you see, we supplied billions of those. But I mean, this is why I say that it's actually not as true as people make it sound. They throw these big numbers. But what we also need to look at is Poland changing their jet fighters, their fighter jets. Right. Okay, but basically, if we look around, the Poland, yes, 16 March, Duda said Poland's Air Force would replace the planes it gives to Ukraine with South Korean-made F-A fighters and United States-made F-35 jets. Essentially, what we're seeing is not that Poland gives like Ukraine the jets which they're gonna use. Is they're saying we're buying new jets, we're getting new jets coming in soon. So what we do is we give Ukraine the jets that Ukraine needs. As something I actually talked about, where I was talking if Ukraine needs F-16s, and I was saying, look, Ukraine just needs planes that can deliver the weapons, right? So it doesn't have to be the new top of the range or something cool. It just has something to be that can do the job. And what the Poland says is like, look, we have the MiG-29s, we have the weapons that we will use. We're gonna, because we are replacing our planes with the new kind, you know, for Poland to keep those jets like MiG-29 fighters just doesn't make sense. As a matter of fact, by supplying those MiG-29s to Ukraine, right, as it says here, right, you know, by moving to the NATO standard and supplying those giving the jets away, the jets to Ukraine, what Poland does is they say, look, you know, now they don't have to pay the money to get rid of those jets, you know, to utilize them, so to break them up and things like this. And this is not a cheap procedure, right? They don't have to invest money into like getting rid of the old missiles and things like this, which they don't have anywhere to put anymore. But they also, if they were like, people will say, oh yeah, but they can just keep the jets just in case. Well, you can't just keep jets just in case. Over the next, you know, you train your pilots to fly new jets, and to keep like a MiG-29 flying, it costs a lot of money, right? So if they put them somewhere like people like military storage bases in US, if you look at the images, alright, there's a military storage bases in US, right? As you can see, they're all based somewhere where climate is rather, quite often it's near some deserts. It's like mid-south US, so it's a pretty dry climate right in the middle of a continent, right? And they can store stuff there for a very long time because it's not gonna rust. It's gonna have some dust sitting on it, but overall it's just gonna be sunshine most of the time, almost no rain, right? And this stuff can stay there for a very long time, right? In places like Poland and places like Ukraine, something that Russians found out is that they were probably taking tanks out, and then they needed to do a lot of stuff simply replacing the metal parts that have rusted away, even though those machines are made from the metal which doesn't rust very easily. But if you keep it in the conditions where the temperature always goes up and down, so always between, like, sometimes it's very cold, sometimes it's very warm. If it gets into humid weather with different variations in the temperatures, you know, plenty of war around, it will rust, it will go to shit, basically. Right, the US keeps a lot of equipment, and we're gonna come back to this because we're gonna touch on to US is like let's just take a look at this one. Right, this is like a base somewhere where they have like cars, the personnel carriers, even probably some old tanks, the trucks. They're essentially sitting in those deserts, and because of the way the weather is, they can be stored for a very long time, right? Poland cannot afford to do this, definitely not with the jets, because again, this stuff goes sideways. It takes a lot of money to then fix it back up and put it back. Same as Serbia can't do that, right? Okay, so what? Oh, it jumped to a new page. Okay, let's put those here, right? So when Poland gives the jets, supplies those jets to Ukraine, it's like, yes, it says that, yeah, these jets, when they were just bought, right, they costed so much, and they say that this in today's money, these jets cost so much, like for example 100 million euros, right? So it sounds like, yeah, the Poland gives Ukraine 100 million euros, but those are the 100 million euros which are essentially worthless to Poland, right? As a matter of fact, storing those jets, like keeping them flying, it's too expensive. Storing them or getting rid of them was going to cost like a few million euros. But also keeping them in storage, even if we look at the way they do it in the US, keeping those storage bases costs money. Right? It's like you have to have security on them. You have to have like technical stuff on there. Just to, if you're storing something, you still have to keep it in some working order. Otherwise, you just got a lot of metal sitting there, which is gonna die soon. So it's like, it's actually a very expensive procedure. It's not cheap, especially in the climates like Poland, Ukraine, most of Europe. We don't have, like, Ukraine probably might be able to get away with some storage because the Ukraine does have the biggest desert in Ukraine, but that desert is also a very popular tourist destination. So storing military equipment there is not really gonna be something Ukraine wants to do. But also, like, storing of the military, like bullets, shells, like, you know, all the other things like missiles as well. It also costs money. Like for example, in Ukraine there were plenty of cases where they would keep like old ammunition, like, and then something caught fire, like, you know, because it was very hot day, the like hot summers, some grass nearby caught fire, and then the whole storage department like blew up. Same things happened in Russia, like, you know, I think something similar things happened a couple of times in Europe as well, where the ammunition storages would simply, like, there's something really hot summer or something like this, dry grass, somebody was smoking, dropped a cigarette into the dry grass, it caught fire, and before you know it, the fire spread really fast across the dried grass, and then your ammunition storage, there's some, you know, some sparks going up and then landed somewhere in the munition, and something blew up, and then the whole thing went flying. So all that stuff is not cheap. One of the reasons, by the way, the ammunition is one of the reasons why they, in the NATO countries, as far as I understand, they do not keep as much as ammunition as you'd expect them to, because they say, hey, there's a lot of us, we do have plenty of ammunition in different places, but overall we're not keeping as much because there's such a big area that we will be able to start producing ammunition once again. And this is something which came out of helping Ukraine, is that, well, actually like NATO countries and their ability to produce ammunition has gone down. So again, I'm probably gonna come back to this in the next video I'm making, which is going to be about economics overall, not just about war, not about war in Ukraine, but the economics of this is like storing a lot of this stuff is like, it's very expensive exercise, right? So when US says US have supplied in Germany supplies Ukraine my spelling's horrible. Yeah, to supply tanks to Ukraine. No. With I think it's Marder. Yeah, so Germany is not supply. Germany supplies Ukraine with 40. There's not tanks. They're actually armored personnel carriers, right? So this is why you see like some people writing this stuff, and it's like complete bullshit, because Marder is not actually a tank. Wants to deliver 40 Marder vehicles. That was 6th of January. Right, but they already did. As far as I've heard, there's at least some of them are already in Ukraine. Sorry. Okay. So, right, yeah, those are tracked vehicles, but they are actually armored personnel carriers. US. To supply Ukraine with APC so it's Stryker armored vehicles in Ukraine. What is US sending to Ukraine? Stryker, and I think something else as well. So US sends those vehicles, but the point is like very much like in this case, many of those articles will say, you see, we're sending to Ukraine, 2.5 billion package in stuff like in these Stryker vehicles. And the point is those Stryker vehicles are the vehicles which have been actually taken off of active service or on the way out of active service, because US is about to change those vehicles into a new type of the vehicle they were getting on top of that. Many of those vehicles are actually very, very, very old, so if we're looking at Marder vehicles, those machines were actually first produced in like 1970s, like end of 60s, 1970s. There's some of the French tanks that the French were supplied to Ukraine as well, RMX 10, I think it says on here, are also like something which has been, they've been used, those tanks that have been used in the first war with Iraq, I believe. So Operation Desert Storm in 1990s, right? Those are the tanks that took part in that operation, right? So French military has actually been working on replacing them with something similar, but those are new tanks with better equipment. And yes, those tanks have been upgraded to a newer standard, but they just simply kind of ran their life. And now the French, instead of like having to store them and then paying money to turn them into like safely, remember those are military equipment, right? So there's a lot of stuff on there which might not be safe, but to safely get rid of those vehicles and turn them into something else, to safely get rid of the ammunition for those vehicles, right? For example, the French tanks that were supplied to Ukraine, they have not French tanks supplied to Ukraine. Let's look. France to supply Ukraine with tanks. Yep. Yeah, follow Ukraine. But a lot of the first tanks, which ones they sent, I don't know, but AMX, let's look them. AMX 10 tanks. Yeah, so those are light tanks, they're wheel-based tanks, but these tanks are actually, the way they built, they have their own types of ammunition, which is not used by any, those tanks, which are not actually used by any other NATO countries. So the France was replacing that particular tank with something new, from what I understand, which would be working with NATO ammunition. And now those tanks will like either being stored, again, storing them somewhere. France does not really have much of a climate for that. Very much like most of the countries in Europe, except maybe Spain and Portugal. So unless France was gonna hire lots of area from like in the south of Spain to store their weapons or something like this, I don't think they had much places where to store them. But also safe storage of ammunition for those tanks, and obviously keeping them up in the conditions that they can up and run again whenever it's necessary. It's just very expensive. Getting rid of them as well is not very cheap as well. It's also millions of euros. And now what they did is that they were slowly getting rid of them. Now they say, okay, we can get rid of them completely. We give them to Ukraine. And it actually, like, on paper, it sounds that France has given billions of euros worth of support to Ukraine, but in reality what they did is they did give a lot of support to Ukraine, but also they got rid of the stuff which is, to be honest, not suitable for their armed forces anymore. Right? So yeah, Striker armed vehicles. Yeah, so when these guys will say, oh look, we've sent 2.5 billion package to Ukraine. Same story, a lot of the vehicles that have been sent, Bradley, Ukraine, okay, US, with Bradley. Right, yeah, those Bradley fighter, again, these are not tanks, those are armored personnel carriers. They have very small cannons just to support the troops. They can carry, I think, up to 6 or 8 people, depending how tight do you want to squeeze them in. Right, it does not, it cannot stand up to a tank in a head-on battle. Nevertheless, one of those Bradleys, there's a couple of those Bradleys that, I don't remember whether it was the first or second Iraq invasion, but they have managed to, between the two Bradleys, they have managed to take out about 20 tanks, 20 Iraqi tanks. It was T-54s or T-64s or T-72s, I don't remember off the top of my head. But the way it happened is they essentially ended up in a position where they came up from a direction where the Iraqi tanks did not expect them to come from, and they have also been on a big hill so they could shoot down with the missiles they had. So they didn't kill as many tanks with their cannons, but they had a very good angle and they came from a direction. So by the time the Iraqi tanks have understood what was going on, where they were shot from, and by the time they managed to, because they were dug in, by the time they started getting out of being dug in, essentially these guys managed to kill most of them and then just ran away, right? So they can be used to fight against tanks, but most of the times, like, you're not gonna be attacking T-72s head on. So like, you can have a very interesting story to tell about this, but they're not really. They use anti-tank missiles as well. So, but like I said, they are not really aimed at being in tank battles. They are there essentially to support your troops in the moving and to getting troops from A to B. Right. So, US supplies a lot of those. Germany supplies Marders, and yes, these vehicles, they're very similar to Bradleys in a way. Some slight differences with the weapons they use and things like this, but the basic idea is about the same as well. So it's like, this is something which you move troops. They do support. They will be sending tanks to Ukraine as well. So there's a bunch of different tanks, including, I think, the old US tanks. So, like, essentially the US would have so many tanks, and some of them are brought up to the most modern standards, and some other ones, they're just sitting there again in storage, like, you know, they're not being used, and they stopped upgrading them like 15-20 years ago. So those tanks are still on that level. Quite often this is a higher level than many Russian tanks. They obviously have better protection than most of the Russian tanks because of the difference in the way the tanks were built in the Soviet Union and in the West. But US to supply Ukraine with tanks. Right, so yeah, Abrams tank, but Abrams tank is not all equal. So some of the Abrams, there's different ways, levels of equipment they have. And again, many of those tanks are sitting there, and essentially sooner or later US is gonna have to pay to get rid of those old tanks which have been just sitting for so long that some of the metal parts just got stuck and they can't be repaired anymore. And obviously the new equipment comes online. The Germany, for example, is getting new, better tanks, and they're looking at, I think from Rheinmetall, a new tank came out, which is like, you cannot upgrade all tanks to that level anymore because there's just so much new equipment that came out, so many new things, so many new ideas, so many new stuff that comes out from as a result of the war in Ukraine as well. The tank, they look like, holy shit, we have all this new equipment which we need to kind of do and try and do, like, because the tank is something that is there to, again, support your infantry against different threats. It's part of a really support system for the soldiers, and so it needs to carry a lot more equipment, unlike what many people think, where the tank is like a moving fortress which takes everything out in its way. In reality, the tank is like there to, again, support your soldiers and keep them from dying. That's why the new tanks coming out with different equipment. So like they have, like, for example, places to have drones on them so that, like, you can do the reconnaissance and things like this with drones rather than with people. And it becomes more complex, and the old tanks, they simply do not have, and they don't have an ability to upgrade those tanks to those level anymore. They just say, look, those tanks, we have done them, we have upgraded as far as they could, but we cannot really push them any further. And so they say, like, look, okay, cool, we're gonna just supply those tanks to Ukraine. So it's like, because again, supplying them to Ukraine, putting them on the ship, because those tanks, like giving them some technical, spit and polish, as they say in England, and just making sure they run, and then supplying them to Ukraine, where everybody understands these tanks are really needed for the next like 5-6 months. After that the war is finished. But the understanding that the more equipment Ukraine has at the moment, and like we say, many NATO tanks will use similar ammunition, it makes it easier. Something again I pointed out in my previous video about Ukraine is like, at this point of time, it's not really just the tanks that matter, it's also the amounts of ammunition that you can supply to you is very, very important, because the Russians are running out of ammunition on their artillery. Beforehand they were shooting a lot. They're already bringing on T-54 tanks. Russia sent T-54 to Ukraine. Right, yeah. So people see them sending those T-54 tanks. Again, these are very old tanks. We're looking. These were released in 1954, right? They started building them in 1954. Same as T-62s that they've been sending slowly to Ukraine. Those tanks. Essentially, people say that the Russians will probably use them as kind of a replacement to artillery, similar to a lot of the Ukrainians were using them. So it's like not shooting in direct battles, but like hiding the tank somewhere behind the hill and just using it to shoot shells, like as an artillery piece. It's a 100mm cannon it has. It's not very long range it will have, but on the other hand, like, again, this is something that you can use. And we can also suspect that they will probably use them in the less dangerous directions, where they can just dig them into the ground, and essentially you have a strong point that has its own moving artillery piece. So it's like it's not going to be able to fight against even modern Ukrainian tanks, so like T-64s. But modern Ukrainian T-64s were easily taking out the Russian T-72s and T-80s, because they were literally just better quality tanks. Like same as here, like don't think they're planning to literally have a head-on battles with Ukrainian tanks or Western tanks, but if you dig something into the ground and you can use its cannon, because it's only like so much sticking out, and it has a reasonably good protection against light fire, so like light guns, 30mm cannons will not be able to penetrate this one as much, so you kind of limited in the way you can take this cannon out. Right, they essentially probably gonna try and use them like this, where they just literally using them as a strong point. We shall see, but they do send those tanks to Ukraine at the moment. Right, so, but again, this is not because and they will say, oh, we've sent like $1 billion worth of tanks into Ukraine, which is like they didn't. It's just all tanks, all weapons which are being sent to Ukraine, the weapons which will, like, West would otherwise need to spend a lot of money. So to get rid of those strikers, it will take money to store them. It costs a lot. This way the Americans say, okay, you can have that, and then it's going to be a problem for Ukrainians to get rid of this equipment when the time comes. But it will serve to Ukraine for a few more years while the country rebuilds, and will be good equipment for Ukrainians if, in case, once they get rid of the Russian forces once, It'd still be a good equipment before Ukraine rebuilds and starts building other weapons for themselves, or work with NATO countries to build purchase newer weapons. This is still going to be a good support against the level of weaponry that Russia has. So it's kind of a win-win situation in this case scenario. But if we're simply talking about like, oh my god, Ukraine has got like 2.5 billion package, well, no, it didn't. Okay? Essentially, this stuff, most of that stuff has costed, like, although on the paper it looks like a 2.5 billion, it's probably costed like 10 times less to fix it up a bit, make sure it runs, add some like ammunition to that, and then ship it to Ukraine by ships, probably not by planes obviously, but by ships, put it all on the ships and ship it to Ukraine. So the total actual cost was actually probably 10 times less than 2.5 billions. But because originally the original prices that have been paid for these machines and other things that were invested into the price, they say, well, we're supplying them equipment which costed us 2.5 billion. But it's the equipment we would be forced to get rid of anyway. So again, it's a very, very touchy question, but we need to address that, because these numbers that have been thrown out there, many people say, well, we shouldn't be helping to this amount of money to Ukraine. One thing we should also consider is that once that old equipment gets rid of, right, it also allows to American military and to European militaries to start ordering new equipment for the future. But it also means it will create new jobs. It means that the companies that produce that stuff, it will be not, it's usually like, oh, this company has designed this, right? And this company gets so much money. But in reality, a lot of this equipment is being made not by one company, which employs 10,000 people, but by about 10 companies, between which they actually employ about 500,000 people, right? Because the tanks, it's not just the metal which it's made of, but it's also the electrical equipment. A lot of the electrical equipment is something which is produced essentially only in NATO countries, right? Because these are usually the requirements. It's something that we can actually source at home. It's not something we buy from China, which also means that it actually gives a push to the local economies. And like I said, I'll be making a video today about economics as well, not about the Ukraine. And I'll probably cover that a bit more in depth. But overall, as I say, one of the reasons that they're increasingly struggling to increase unemployment in many places is because, well, all of a sudden they need to produce lots of stuff which they have not been producing for a very long time, and the companies hiring people are willing to hire people a bit more, and there's other reasons, but yeah. So essentially the war in Ukraine is probably the reason many people in the US and Europe are still staying employed. Think about that. Obviously, right, there's obviously other things which come in from Ukraine, which are like some of the stuff which is needed for Europe, including the big places where they can get gas from, shale gas basins in Ukraine, for example, some metals and some other stuff. So again, things that make lives helping Ukraine make sense, because it actually increases the security not just of Europe but of the world in general. Okay, we're gonna look at that. Where we have a map here. Alright, so before we finish, we're gonna look at this one, which is like total Russian losses. And again, when people say like, why should we help Ukraine, it's like, Well, the faster you help Ukraine, the less time we're gonna have to look at shit like this, okay? So the overall killed the personnel, they started with about 150,000 force, and they obviously brought in people from like mercenary groups and from Donetsk, Lugansk, for example. But essentially at the moment the number of people killed are about equal to the number they have actually started the invasion with. So 500,000 wounded. Obviously, look, when people say 500,000 wounded, some people might have been wounded more than once. So this number is like this number of confirmed people, confirmed wounds. That would be that, right? So 190 intended for invasion originally, so 170 have been killed. So the Russians will be bringing in more people, but it actually screws up their economy big time, and they're struggling. The whole economy goes to crap because of that. So again, they say that Russians gonna bring in more mobilized troops. They started new mobilizations, expecting to bring up another 150 to 200,000 at least, but obviously the people they mobilized first, many of them have already been to the front and many of them are already dead, but many have been trained over the last few months, including in driving T-54s, the ones we talked about. Right, but essentially it seems that to me that they just want to bring in as many people as they can and just have a half-aggressive defense, which means that they'll be trying to attack on certain points just to keep the Ukrainians from attacking the places where they're the weakest. Right, so armored combat vehicles, so this is like armored personnel carriers, like light vehicles. So over 6,000 or nearly 7,000 have been destroyed total in armed forces. I think it probably involves the trucks as well, like petrol carriers and things like this. So yeah, originally they intended only about 3,000 for invasion to Ukraine. Yeah, they have lost 3,595 tanks apparently destroyed. Again, we've seen that a lot of those tanks were captured, where the Russians just dropped them and ran away. As apparently the amount of equipment that Ukrainian army has received from Russian troops in the cost of equipment that Ukrainians have captured from Russians is actually higher than the cost of the entire support the Ukrainians have received from NATO countries, from the West. So again, some of that equipment is already back to war. Some of it is being fixed up because it wasn't in a very good state of repair. But we're also saying that a lot of equipment that Russians were bringing in is so old that, to be honest, using it on the battlefield is a danger to yourself rather than to the enemy. Right? But originally, Russian forces had just over 3,000 tanks. They've actually lost a lot more. So yeah, they've been rebuilding old tanks, T-64s, T-62s, and they're losing a lot of that. So artillery, but again, also we can say that these numbers are maybe a bit more inflated than we'd like to. There's another one. Vehicles 5,000, fuel tanks, artillery systems. No, tanks 3,500. So it's two different sources, but they're about the same. Yeah, this one shows a bit more. This one shows a bit less. So, but armored personnel 170,000. So it's pretty much. Helicopters, a lot of their helicopters have been knocked down. I don't think it's going to be all of them. Right, so yeah, 30% of Russian armed forces helicopters are lost. But again, like when we look at the armed forces, not all helicopters are actually there for that are used can be used in battle. So aircrafts as well. Alright, 305. We're looking out of 1,379 in total of armed forces. And again, the armed forces will have different airplanes which aim for different. So we have to be very careful with these numbers, because when they say we knocked out these aircraft, 305 aircraft, are those fighter jets, are those bombers, are those like people carrying planes, are those like supply carrying planes? So this needs to be a bit awkward one. But again, like I said, same in Ukraine. Like, you know, Ukraine needs more than just one thing. It's like, so losing the fighter jets is not all be all, like, right? But one thing I like about this one is this is a good thing, right? This shows like how much troops, the losses in that Russia have suffered in Ukraine, like over 100,000. Now, Afghan war, the total losses of just over 15,000 over like 10 years, and yet the results of Afghan war have been one of the key detrimental parts to the fall of Soviet Union, right? So this is the amount of losses you have down there, right? And this is actually, but this is actually nearly one of the detrimental parts of the Soviet Union. The first Chechen war was, losing that war was like, the only thing that kept Russia together is that shit was already going sideways. So when they lost the first Chechen war, they just managed to keep things intact, the country intact, but it was a really heavy blow to the Russian psyche. So the second Chechen war, they've lost double the amount of people in the second Chechen war, and they won it, but by turning like city of Grozny into essentially a moonscape. Again, similar what they do in some Ukrainian places, right? And again, back then, if the world has actually, like, people around the world have actually stopped Russia back then, now today we would not have the problems we have in Ukraine. We're speaking like tens of thousands of civilians, women, children, all people killed. We're also speaking about like over 100,000, 170,000 personnel killed in Ukraine. Like, we don't know how many civilians have been killed in Russia because these dumb fucks just sent a missile in the wrong direction. We have heard that some cities have been, like, that are near Ukrainian border, they've been shooting missiles near the city from behind the city. So if we say that this is a border of Ukraine, this is the city, and they would be shooting the missiles from behind the city to use their own civilians as a shield against Ukrainian return fire, and then they fuck up and their missiles end up landing, I think, in Belgorod, somewhere there. Like, you know, there was some things happened there, a couple of other cities where the Russian missiles would land in the cities from behind of which they were shooting. Right, so again, civilians, number of civilians, like things that happened in Bucha, in many other places around Ukraine where lots of civilians were killed for no good reasons, just because they killed one civilian and somebody saw them doing that, and they would just trying to kill all the witnesses. So all in all, like I said, this website shows the total cost of the Russians to the military equipment in monetary terms. Right, 17.5 billion US dollars, the equivalent of 17.5 billion US dollars. these are the losses of Russian military in Ukraine at the moment. Right, again we're saying that, look, it's very kind of fluent number, because if we take T-72 for example, which has been in service, like there's a different models of T-72s. The most, like the one which is used the most is like really cheap model, and to be honest, those tanks needed to be going out of service like 20 years ago, but they just kept them running because they don't have anything better. Right, so but again, in reality, we have to be very careful with those numbers, because a lot of that equipment goes back in time all the way into like 70s, 80s, at the time of Soviet Union, and it's not a new equipment. The Russian troops did not have that much good quality new equipment, right? But we're also talking about the losses of economy in economic terms to Russia, which are going to the point where they have completely wasted their entire budget for the year. They have wasted it in the first 2 months of 2023. By now, their budget is already the whole country's budget is already gone. Right, it's been spent on things nobody knows where did it go and who stole it. So, but okay, but I think we've covered the economics of this situation. Like obviously, as a Ukrainian, I might be a little bit biased when it comes to stuff like this, but technically, say I'd like. Oh, this is just the maps, deep state. We're gonna go to this one here. But technically, like I said, when we're talking about the economics, like of supporting to Ukraine, to be honest, a lot of times, not all, sometimes they do build new weapons, like some missiles they send to Ukraine, some ammunition they send to Ukraine is already new missiles and new munitions, because the storage the amount of weapons they had in the storage is already pretty much gone, so they build in new missiles and some new munitions. But a lot of time when we talk about the equipment that is being sent to Ukraine, it is actually, technically it's not even 250, it's not even the money the money they say this equipment costs. But technically, the getting rid of this equipment would actually end up costing more than sending it to Ukraine. So technically, we have to be very careful with these numbers, because, like I said, probably the actual cost is 250 million. But if we take into consideration the amount of money and the resources that would need to be spent to store a lot of that equipment, and then to get rid of it safely, and to get rid of the ammunition for that if it's not usable, we could probably even safely say that US did not spend 250 million at sending it there. US probably saved 250 million by sending this equipment to Ukraine. So, but like I said, each case needs to be looked at separately, but in many cases that is the case. So we have to be very careful about this, and like I said, if you do want stuff like this to be, like, if you got to this point and if you think that this needs to be shared, like, if it makes sense to you, please click like, please share this to other people, because I'm hoping that it will raise awareness and it will get people who are more into doing those videos to be into making those videos and sharing them and reaching more people, so that they understood what is actually happening, rather than what is that the next person who doesn't quite understand the economics of all this says to them. Or quite often many of those people are, to be honest, seem to be financed by the Russians, and you go like, sorry brother, but all the information you say seems to be coming straight from the KGB, like, or FSB now, right? But I think I'm gonna stop here. Oh, it's been a while since I talked as much. Okay, I wish you all the best, and like I say, click like, click share, and hopefully we'll see you again. Thank you very much.